In the sands of ancient Egypt, beneath skies scorched by the desert sun, an empire rose that dazzled the world with its wealth, architecture, and military power. Egypt was not simply a kingdom, it was the image of human dominance at its peak, the expression of what happens when civilization exalts itself above conscience. Its pyramids pierced the heavens, its kings wore crowns as though they were gods, and its religion cloaked idolatry in grandeur. The nation stood tall in the eyes of the world, yet in the eyes of heaven, it was already on the edge of a fall it could not perceive. At the center of this empire stood Pharaoh, not merely a ruler by birthright, but a man worshipped as divine. He was the embodiment of Egypt's strength, the voice of its gods, and the enforcer of its rule. He was revered not because of wisdom or virtue, but because the system demanded it. His words carried the weight of law, and his presence commanded fear. But beneath the robes of royalty and behind the gilded throne sat a man of flesh and blood, vulnerable to the same pride that corrupts every heart. Pharaoh was not just a political figure, he became the very image of rebellion against God. Egypt, as scripture and history alike reveal, did not fall because of external enemies or military weakness. It fell because it lifted itself against the one who rules above all. When a nation turns its confidence inward, trusting in its economy, its traditions, and its rulers, rather than in justice and truth, it becomes fertile ground for arrogance. Egypt became the perfect symbol of what it means to reject divine authority while clinging to man-made strength. Its temples may have been majestic, but its heart was distant from the truth. Pharaoh's decision to resist the will of God was not born of ignorance. He heard the warnings, saw the signs, and understood what was being asked of him. But rather than yield, he doubled down. Each command from Moses became another opportunity to assert his own will, to prove that he was still in control. What began as political resistance soon transformed into spiritual confrontation. He was no longer dealing with Moses, a man raised in his own household. He was confronting the living God who had sent him. This story, though ancient, remains alarmingly current. The same spirit that lived in Pharaoh, the unwillingness to bow, the illusion of self-sufficiency, the rejection of higher truth, still walks among us. It can be found in governments that mock justice, in individuals who refuse correction, in hearts that cling to control even when life itself begins to collapse. Pharaoh is not just a historical figure. He is a reflection of what happens when pride convinces a person that he is answerable to no one. This account is more than a record of miracles and plagues. It is a declaration of who God is, how he responds to oppression, and what becomes of those who stand against his will. Pharaoh dared to challenge the eternal. He set himself against the one who gives breath to every living soul. And in doing so, he learned a truth that resounds through eternity. No crown, no throne, no army can prevail against the voice of God. In the shadow of the Nile, surrounded by monuments carved with hieroglyphs of praise and permanence, Pharaoh stood not merely as a king, but as one who believed himself divine. This belief was not born in a moment. It was cultivated over time, fed by the reverence of a nation, the silence of the oppressed, and the echo of his own unchecked will. The illusion of divinity is rarely a sudden descent. It is a slow rising, like mist climbing a mountain, until the summit is hidden and the man standing atop can no longer see the valley from which he came. Pharaoh's belief in his own godhood was not just arrogance. It was self-deception raised to the level of theology. He was worshipped not for who he was, but for what the system around him demanded him to be. Priests bowed before him, not because they knew his soul, but because the power of the throne compelled them. Subjects honored his decrees, not out of love, but out of fear. And in this environment, truth became a casualty. When no one dares to question the man in power forgets he is a man. The human heart, when left to its own desires and surrounded by praise, has a terrible tendency to ascend beyond its rightful place. Pharaoh, raised to see himself as the mediator between gods and mortals, eventually believed he had no need for any authority higher than his own. His word became law, and his law became unquestioned. He no longer discerned the boundary between submission and tyranny, between reverence and idolatry, and in this confusion he embraced the most ancient of lies, the belief that he could be like God. This deception is as old as time itself. Long before Pharaoh, a voice in a garden once whispered to mankind, "You will be like God." That same voice has found many listeners since, and in Pharaoh it found an eager disciple. The temptation to rule without accountability, to possess power without moral tether, and to live without fear of judgment is not reserved for ancient kings. It resides in the corridors of every human heart. The story of Pharaoh is not distant, it is disturbingly near. Unchecked power does not merely corrupt outward behavior, it corrodes inward humility. Pride is not content to remain in the background. It grows roots, entangles the soul, and blinds the eyes to reality. Pharaoh was not blind because he lacked sight. He was blind because he refused to see. He dismissed signs, warnings, and pleas, not because they lacked clarity, but because they threatened his illusion of control. To acknowledge another authority would be to admit limitation. And for a man who had come to believe he was God, limitation was intolerable. The greater tragedy was not Pharaoh's belief in his own divinity. It was his refusal to entertain the possibility that he was wrong. A teachable heart is never beyond redemption, but a hardened heart is deaf even to the thunder of heaven. Every encounter Pharaoh had with truth was met with resistance. Every call to humility was answered with defiance. His crown had become more than a symbol of rule. It had become a shackle upon his soul, binding him to an identity forged in pride. The danger of believing oneself to be beyond correction is that the voice of God, no matter how loud, begins to sound like noise rather than counsel. Pharaoh's life demonstrates what happens when a man confuses position with perfection. His throne may have been high, but it could not reach the heavens. His armies may have been strong, but they could not silence the voice of the Eternal. And yet he persisted in the belief that he was above judgment, above failure, above need. This spirit did not die with Pharaoh. It walks among modern men and women, often unseen yet deeply rooted. It is found in leaders who wield power without conscience, in individuals who see themselves as the final authority over right and wrong, in cultures that worship independence from any higher law. The spirit of Pharaoh is not about royal garments or golden scepters. It is about the refusal to kneel. It is about the exaltation of self to a throne it was never meant to occupy. And when it does not ask for permission. Power is not evil in itself. Authority is not wicked by nature. But when power is divorced from humility, and authority is stripped of reverence for the true God, what remains is tyranny cloaked in divinity. Pharaoh became the embodiment of that distortion, and in doing so he stands as a timeless example of what happens when a man confuses himself with the one who gave him breath. In Psalm 10 verse 4 it is written, "In his pride the wicked does not seek him. In all his thoughts there is no room for God." These words could have been etched above Pharaoh's throne, not as an accusation, but as a mirror. Let us not dismiss this as ancient history. Let us not believe that such pride is confined to rulers of old. Every heart is capable of building its own Egypt, of crowning its own self as king. And every soul must decide, will I rule my life as God, or will I surrender it to the one who truly is? Long before confrontation ever reached Pharaoh's court, long before plagues would descend like thunder, there were groans in the darkness, deep aching cries that rose not from palaces but from mud pits, not from thrones but from calloused hands burdened by the weight of injustice. The Israelites, once honored guests in the land of Egypt, had become slaves under its rising power. Their journey from welcome to bondage was not marked by a single event, but by a slow tightening of chains, generation after generation. What began with favor ended in forced labor, in the grinding sorrow of days that blurred into years and years that vanished into silence. They were a people not merely trapped in a place, but crushed in spirit. The work was relentless, the masters cruel, and the sense of abandonment profound. To be enslaved is not only to lose your freedom, it is to have your dignity stripped, your voice suppressed, and your identity reduced to production. The Israelites became brickmakers, laborers under a scorching sun. Their lives counted not in memories or meaning, but in quotas and punishments. Yet even as their hands built cities they would never inhabit, their hearts held on to something far more enduring than mortar or stone. They held on to the hope, fragile yet unbroken, that they were not forgotten. The groans that echoed through Egyptian fields were not political protests or public revolts. They were whispers to heaven, pleas buried under layers of despair. These cries were the language of the oppressed, simple, wordless sounds born from pain too deep for speech. It was not merely suffering that defined them, but the endurance of their cry. Though years passed without visible answers, they did not fall into silence. Though the night seemed long and the heavens still, they continued to call. There is something sacred in a cry that refuses to die, something powerful in the endurance of hope when nothing around you justifies it. The Israelites cried not because they expected immediate relief, but because something within them still believed in a God who sees, who hears, and who remembers. Even when they did not understand the silence, they trusted in the memory of covenant, in the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, men who once walked with God and heard his voice. They believed that the God who had once promised would not forget. Waiting is often the most painful form of suffering, not because of the pain itself, but because of the uncertainty that comes with it. Every day under Pharaoh's rule seemed to challenge the idea that justice would ever prevail. Every unanswered cry became a test of faith. When the heavens are quiet and the oppressors grow stronger, it becomes difficult to believe that compassion still reigns above. And yet compassion was there, not as a distant thought, but as a living fire hidden beneath the veil of time. The pain of the Israelites was not unnoticed. Their sighs reached beyond the walls of Egypt, rising through time and space into the throne room of the Eternal. While they labored under taskmasters who saw them as tools, their God saw them as sons and daughters. The silence they feared was not abandonment, it was preparation. What seemed like delay was not indifference, but the setting of a stage, the alignment of purposes far greater than any eye could see. In the corridors of divine providence, every cry matters. There is no groan too quiet, no tear too small to catch the attention of the one who created hearts and hears them breaking. The suffering of the Israelites was recorded in heaven not as statistics, but as sacred echoes. Their affliction was not a footnote in history, it was a catalyst for divine movement. The compassion of God is not measured by how quickly he acts, but by how deeply he enters into the pain of his people. He is not a distant observer. He is a witness who carries the memory of every injustice, the weight of every unspoken sorrow. And when he moves, he does so not only to change the circumstances, but to transform the meaning of suffering itself. The cry of the Israelites was not wasted breath. It was seed, planted in tears, but destined to yield freedom. There is something profoundly human about crying in the night. It is the moment when strength fades, when defenses fall, and when the soul reaches beyond itself in desperation. But it is also profoundly divine, for it is often in the night that heaven draws closest, not with the noise of armies, but with the quiet certainty that justice will come. Not always when we expect it, not always how we imagine it, but always with perfect timing. The Israelites did not know the full scope of what was coming. They did not see the plan unfolding, but they cried, and that cry was enough. It stirred heaven, it summoned a deliverer, and it prepared the way for a confrontation that would shake the foundation of empires. Theirs was not a cry of weakness. It was a declaration of endurance, a testimony that even in chains, the human soul still longs for freedom and still believes that justice has a voice. No cry for justice is ever truly forgotten. No pain offered in truth is ever wasted. The night may feel endless, but the morning is never far behind. And in the story of the Israelites, we find a reflection of every heart that waits in darkness, longing for light. The silence of the heavens, though long and heavy, was never permanent. It was not forgetfulness that had delayed divine action, but the measured patience of a God who always moves with purpose. And when he chose to act, he did not send a sword, nor did he unleash storms without cause. Instead, he sent a man, not a warrior dressed in armor, nor a philosopher bearing clever words, but a shepherd from the wilderness, one who had once known Egypt's halls of power, but who had long since been stripped of every illusion of grandeur. Moses, shaped not by palaces, but by solitude, not by ambition, but by obedience, became the chosen voice to carry a message that would echo through all generations. Let my people go. This was no diplomatic mission. Moses was not summoned to negotiate terms or offer compromise. He came bearing a word that stood outside the realm of human politics and royal customs. The command he carried was not his own invention, nor was it crafted to appeal to Pharaoh's pride. It was divine in origin and absolute in tone. Let my people go. These words were not couched in polite suggestion. They were a summons from heaven, a declaration that the God of creation had seen enough, waited long enough, and now demanded release. It was not Egypt's decision to make, it was God's decree to enforce. The confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh was never merely personal. It was not the battle of two men, but the collision of two realms, earthly power standing face to face with heavenly will. In the throne room of Egypt, a mortal king who believed himself divine was about to learn the difference between authority and omnipotence. And yet, God did not come first with wrath. He came with warning, not because he was uncertain of the outcome, but because his nature is to give space for repentance before judgment. Every command that passed through Moses' lips was an opportunity, not a threat. Every meeting between prophet and king was a mercy extended, an opening for Pharaoh to turn, to listen, to yield. But Pharaoh did not hear the message for what it truly was. He saw Moses as a nuisance, a relic of the past, a man too old to matter and too bold to fear. He heard the words, but missed their weight. He mistook the gentleness of the warning for weakness and believed that his position shielded him from consequence. What Pharaoh failed to understand was that when heaven speaks, it is never to entertain, it is to establish. The voice of God does not enter human courts to flatter kings. It comes to declare truth and to demand obedience. Moses did not come alone. Though he carried a staff and walked with hesitant steps, he was not acting by his own authority. Every word he spoke was breathed into him by the one who had called him from a burning bush. That same voice, which had revealed its name as I Am, now thundered through a human vessel, confronting the arrogance of a throne built on oppression. And yet in this divine confrontation, there remained space for change. God could have acted in an instant, but instead, he unfolded his plan through repeated encounters, each one offering Pharaoh a chance to respond differently. The mercy and the warning cannot be overstated. For every word Moses spoke, there was time to reconsider. For every sign performed, there was an invitation to surrender. Judgment was not the first weapon drawn. Instead, the patience of God stood as a shield before the storm, giving Pharaoh time he did not deserve, but desperately needed. But pride, once it takes root, rarely sees mercy as a gift. Instead, it views it as weakness. Pharaoh saw each warning as something to dismiss, another test to resist, another moment to reinforce his power. He could not see that these were not negotiations. Heaven was not haggling. God was not sending a messenger to suggest reform. He was demanding release. Let my people go. Not because they deserved freedom on Pharaoh's terms, but because they belonged to someone greater. They were not Pharaoh's property, they were God's people. And when God claims what is his, no human power can stand in the way without facing the consequences. In this divine message, there is a principle that extends beyond Egypt and its king. When God sends a warning, it is always layered with mercy. It is never casual, never accidental. It comes with precision, with purpose, and with the heartbeat of grace woven into every syllable. But it is not indefinite. There is a limit to the patience shown, not because God is unkind, but because justice, when delayed too long, becomes injustice itself. Pharaoh was given more chances than many would consider fair, yet each one was met with hardened resolve. The voice of God, though gentle in warning, would not be ignored forever. The same command that began with mercy would, if resisted, end with judgment. And this message, though ancient, still speaks today. It reminds every ruler, every system, every heart intoxicated with control, that God does not forget the cries of the oppressed, and that when he moves to act, he does so with full authority. Let my people go. That command was not merely historical, it was theological, moral, spiritual. It was not about politics, it was about ownership. God was reclaiming what belonged to him, and Pharaoh was being offered the chance to yield willingly before he would be forced to submit by power. The line had been drawn, the confrontation had begun, and though the weight of judgment had not yet fallen, the words that had been spoken were enough to shift the course of history. There is a profound mystery in the way the human heart responds to the voice of truth. It can be softened by a whisper or steeled by a thunderclap. In Pharaoh's case, the heart that once beat with the pulse of a man became over time the fortress of a tyrant, sealed against both reason and revelation. Each time Moses stood before him, speaking on behalf of the living God, Pharaoh was presented with a choice, one that was not abstract or philosophical, but deeply moral. Yet each time he chose defiance over humility, resistance over repentance, power over submission. The hardening of Pharaoh's heart was not a random event or the result of sudden divine interference. It was the accumulation of many deliberate refusals, a pattern formed by habit and reinforced by pride. Rebellion never starts as a loud outcry. It begins quietly, in moments where conscience is silenced, where a decision is made not to listen, not to change. For Pharaoh, the first act of resistance did not come from a heart set entirely against God. It came from the unwillingness to lose control, to yield his will to a greater authority. He listened to Moses' words, watched the signs unfold before him, and yet, in the stillness of his inner world, he told himself that he did not need to change. This was not ignorance, it was a calculated denial. With each warning that followed, he grew bolder in his rejection, until his heart became something more than resistant. It became immovable. The anatomy of rebellion is not built in a single day. It is formed in layers, each one hardened by the refusal to bend. Sin, when unrepented, does not merely stain the soul, it shapes it. It teaches the heart to adapt, to explain away conviction, to reinterpret warning as exaggeration, to take divine patience as a sign of divine absence. Pharaoh saw the mercy of God displayed in delay, and rather than trembling at it, he misread it as permission to persist. This is one of the most subtle dangers in spiritual life, the assumption that because judgment has not come, it never will. But what Pharaoh failed to grasp is that mercy extended is not the same as mercy guaranteed. With every plague that visited Egypt, with every new sign that declared the power of the true God, Pharaoh had the chance to change his course. Yet he would relent only under pressure, only until the discomfort passed, and once the threat faded, he returned to his former position, more convinced of his power and less sensitive to truth. This cycle reveals the true nature of a hardened heart. It does not simply reject truth once, but builds a rhythm of rejection, where even pain becomes an occasion to reinforce pride. Pharaoh's heart became so calloused that even as his kingdom groaned under the weight of divine warning, he could not see the hand of mercy that had yet to strike with final force. One of the most sobering aspects of this progression is how familiar it can become. Rebellion, when dressed in the garments of strength and self-assurance, does not appear monstrous. It often looks reasonable, even justified. Pharaoh likely saw himself as protecting his nation, maintaining order, standing firm against chaos. But in reality, he was exalting himself above the voice of the one who had made him. He traded truth for security, exchanged conviction for convenience, and chose his throne over righteousness. This is the slow deception of sin. It does not only blind the eyes, it redefines the landscape. What once was clearly wrong begins to seem necessary. What once provoked fear now invites indifference. The plagues, each more intense than the last, were not designed only to punish, but to awaken. They were divine interventions, each carrying the hope that Pharaoh might see, might understand, might repent. Yet with every act of resistance, the possibility of softness diminished, not because God closed the door, but because Pharaoh refused to walk through it. There comes a point in the journey of rebellion where the heart no longer hears. Not because God has stopped speaking, but because the soul has stopped listening. This is not punishment, it is consequence. To ignore conviction repeatedly is to teach the heart that truth does not matter, that justice is irrelevant, that one's own desires are sovereign. Pharaoh's descent was not marked by external defeat first. It began in the invisible realm of his will, where each choice to reject God formed the next step down. The danger of a hardened heart lies not just in its resistance to God, but in its increasing inability to recognize the need for change. Pharaoh did not wake up one morning consumed by pride. He arrived there step by step, moment by moment, in the false security that he could always change later, that he still had time. But rebellion always overestimates tomorrow. It assumes there will always be another chance, always another warning, always another Moses to come with a word of grace. Yet each rejection makes the next harder to hear. Pharaoh, once the master of a great empire, became a prisoner of his own refusal. His kingdom trembled, his people suffered, but his heart would not yield. This is the deepest tragedy. Not merely that he resisted God, but that he lost the ability to respond, even when surrounded by evidence that demanded surrender. What begins as pride can end in ruin. What starts as a whisper of defiance can grow into a roar of destruction. And the heart, once so full of life and possibility, can become a monument to what might have been, had it only listened, had it only turned, had it only responded to mercy while it was still being offered. When Pharaoh refused to humble himself, and when the heart of Egypt's ruler grew resistant beyond reason, the warnings that once echoed with mercy began to manifest as signs too disruptive to ignore. These were not random acts of destruction. The plagues that descended upon Egypt came with precision, each one carrying meaning beyond the surface. They were messages carved into the very fabric of Egypt's theology, tearing down its idols, one by one. These were not simply acts of judgment. They were declarations from heaven, demonstrating that the so-called gods of the Nile, sky, sun, and soil were nothing more than illusions. In the battle between truth and tradition, the Lord did not merely confront Pharaoh's defiance. He dismantled the spiritual lies that undergirded an entire civilization. The first blow struck the Nile, the very river that sustained Egypt's power and pride. Its waters turned to blood, and with it, the illusion of Egypt's self-sufficiency began to bleed away. The Nile was not only a geographical feature, it was a deity in Egyptian belief, worshipped as the giver of life. By defiling it so completely, God revealed that life does not flow from created things, no matter how revered. The river that had been a source of nourishment and control became a channel of death and decay. Fish died, the land stank, and the people recoiled. The humiliation of Egypt had begun, not because God sought vengeance, but because truth had to break through centuries of deception. Then came the frogs, emerging from the very river that had just been judged. In Egyptian culture, the frog was sacred, associated with fertility and divine birth. Yet what had once been a symbol of blessing became an unbearable curse. Frogs covered the land, invading homes, food, and even beds. The irony was piercing. That which was once praised became a plague, reminding all who watched that when creation is worshipped instead of the Creator, it can turn against those who venerate it. The gods Egypt trusted in were being exposed, not by foreign armies or philosophical arguments, but by the Creator's direct intervention. With each plague that followed, gnats rising from the dust, swarms of flies corrupting the air, livestock struck down, boils erupting on skin, Egypt's confidence in its gods eroded further. The earth, the animals, the human body itself, all elements which had their corresponding deities, fell under affliction. Every layer of Egyptian life was touched, not arbitrarily but with surgical intent. The gods of healing could not stop the boils. The gods of protection failed to guard the livestock. The gods of order stood silent as chaos spread. Each judgment peeled away another veil of Egypt's spiritual blindness, and with every blow, the message grew louder: there is no God but the Lord. When hail came, accompanied by fire flashing through the sky, it was not just weather, it was a declaration. The heavens themselves, once believed to be governed by deities who balanced nature, turned against Egypt. Crops were destroyed, trees shattered, and fields ravaged. The economy of Egypt, rooted in agriculture and seasons, began to unravel. Yet still, Pharaoh remained unyielding, his heart dulled by the illusion that he could endure what God had begun. Even when his own officials began to fear the power of Moses' God and pleaded for him to act, Pharaoh continued his charade of control. What made these plagues so devastating was not only their physical impact, but their theological implications. Egypt was a society deeply rooted in ritual, in appeasing a vast pantheon of gods believed to manage every aspect of life. By targeting these domains one by one, God was not simply punishing Egypt, he was discrediting its entire worldview. This was not vengeance cloaked in natural disasters. This was revelation through disruption. Egypt had built its power on a spiritual framework that was false, and the God of Israel tore it down with clarity and might. Even the plague of darkness carried profound meaning. The sun god Ra, among the most powerful deities in Egyptian mythology, was silenced as darkness fell over the land for 3 days. It was a suffocating, tangible absence, not just of light, but of hope. The people could not move, nor see, nor understand how the most basic rhythms of life had failed them. Darkness was not simply the absence of sun, it was the exposure of the impotence of Egypt's supposed protector. In the silence and stillness of that blackness, every man and woman in Egypt was forced to confront a question that had long been buried beneath ritual and tradition. What if our gods are not real? And still, through each of these judgments, there was space for Pharaoh to change, space for the people to turn. These plagues, though terrifying, were progressive, escalating in intensity but never unleashed all at once. This was the patience of God, even in wrath. It was a path laid stone by stone, not merely to humble Pharaoh, but to awaken a nation that had been spiritually asleep. The hope was not to destroy for destruction's sake, but to bring recognition, to remove every barrier, every excuse, every false shelter. What Egypt encountered in those days was not simply superior force, it was divine revelation. And that revelation came not with soft words, but with the trembling of a kingdom that had believed itself secure. Pharaoh had challenged God by refusing to heed his voice. In response, God answered not just with power, but with precision. Every plague carried a message, and every message bore the same conclusion: the Lord alone is God. There are moments in history so heavy with sorrow, so marked by finality, that even silence feels insufficient to carry their weight. The death of Egypt's firstborn was one such moment. It was not a sudden act of rage, nor an arbitrary expression of power, but the inevitable end of a path that had been warned, resisted, and yet still chosen. From the very first command, "Let my people go," God had made his will known with clarity. With every sign, every plague, every opportunity to turn, the road of mercy remained open. But mercy that is rejected does not vanish. It gives way to justice, and justice, once awakened, does not retreat. Pharaoh had been given more chances than most men in history. He had seen his rivers turn to blood, his land overtaken by pests and disease, his skies darkened, and his gods disgraced. He had heard the pleas of his own counselors urging him to relent. He had witnessed the suffering of his people under a hand he could have lifted, yet his heart, already weathered by pride and shaped by rebellion, chose to press forward. The price of that decision was not merely his own burden to carry. It fell upon a nation, and in its most vulnerable place, its children. The warning had been clear. The final plague would come not with smoke or wind, but with the stillness of death, moving unseen through the heart of Egypt. The firstborn of every household, from the palace to the prisoner's cell, would be struck down in a single night. This was not a punishment aimed at innocent lives. It was the final consequence of hardened leadership and a culture that had stood behind it. Pharaoh, who had refused to heed the cry of the oppressed, would now hear the cry of his own people rise into the night with the same anguish he had ignored for so long. There is a cost to defiance, not merely in the breaking of divine command, but in the ripple it causes through lives that were never meant to carry its weight. Egypt's mourning was not staged or ceremonial. It was real, raw, and irreversible. Fathers found sons still and breathless. Mothers held children they could not revive. The empire that once seemed untouchable was now pierced at its heart. The pride that had kept Pharaoh's spine straight now bowed his head, not in worship, but in devastation. Yet even in this darkest of hours, there was a thread of redemption woven through the night. For the people of Israel, there had been an instruction, clear, specific, and sacred. They were to take the blood of a lamb, spotless and without blemish, and mark their doorposts with it. Inside their homes, they were to eat in readiness, not as victims waiting for death, but as travelers preparing to be free. The destroyer would pass through the land, but where the blood was seen, death would not enter. It was not the strength of the people inside that saved them. It was not their heritage, their prayers, or their works. It was the blood. This act, known ever after as the Passover, became a defining moment not only in the history of Israel, but in the unfolding story of redemption itself. The lamb was not merely a ritual symbol. It pointed to something far greater, a future deliverance, a greater lamb whose blood would once again mark the doors of human hearts. But that night in Egypt, as wails echoed through the streets and the air hung heavy with grief, it served as a line of separation between those who responded to God in obedience and those who continued to resist him. Pharaoh, confronted at last with a loss he could neither explain nor undo, summoned Moses in the darkness and released the people he had once enslaved. It was not a negotiation, it was a collapse. The man who had once stood unmoved by miracles and unbothered by suffering now trembled under the weight of divine justice. But even then, it was not repentance that stirred him. It was resignation. He let the Israelites go not because he had come to honor their God, but because he could no longer afford to defy him. The difference between surrender and submission is often revealed in crisis, and Pharaoh's heart, though broken for a moment, had not yet truly bowed. The death of the firstborn was not a single event, but the culmination of all that had preceded it. It was the result of warnings ignored, opportunities squandered, and mercy rejected. It revealed not only the seriousness of sin, but the holiness of the one who confronts it. God had not acted rashly. He had spoken again and again through signs, through Moses, through every escalating plague. But when the cries of the afflicted had gone unanswered for too long, when the stubbornness of one man endangered the destiny of millions, judgment came, not as a sudden act, but as a long-withheld answer. This moment forces reflection, not only on the cost of rebellion, but on the offer of protection that had always been present. The blood on the doorposts was more than a ritual. It was a sign that someone else had died in the place of the firstborn. It was a picture of substitution, of life preserved through sacrifice. In the story of Exodus, it became the foundation of freedom. In the story of humanity, it would later point to a greater freedom still. The night of Egypt's sorrow was also the night of Israel's deliverance. The same event that broke Pharaoh's grip opened the door to liberation. Judgment and mercy met in the same hour, but in different places. One home wailed, another sang. One cradle was emptied, another child was spared. The difference was not in their strength or status, but in their response to the voice of God. The cost of defiance is never theoretical. It leaves marks, it writes history. And when mercy is extended again and again, yet cast aside, what remains is not unjust judgment, but judgment long delayed. Egypt had been given time, and Pharaoh had been given chance after chance. But the longer mercy is refused, the heavier the weight of its absence becomes. There are moments when loss should bring reflection, when devastation ought to humble even the most resolute soul. Pharaoh, having seen the death of his own son and the anguish of his people, had reached a point most would consider unendurable. The night of sorrow that passed through Egypt was not a quiet moment of regret. It was an upheaval, a collapse of power, a divine interruption that shattered illusions and crushed confidence. And yet, even in the aftermath of such judgment, something within Pharaoh refused to surrender. What could have been the beginning of wisdom became instead the breeding ground of further defiance. The Israelites had finally left, not as fugitives, but as a free people under the direction of God. They walked out of Egypt, not in shame or secrecy, but with purpose, with spoils in hand, and with the promise of a new identity taking shape. For a time, Pharaoh let them go. His words, bitter and heavy in the night, were not those of a humbled man, but of one momentarily overwhelmed. As the days passed and the dust settled, the pain of loss did not soften his heart. It stirred his pride once again. The weight of his previous decisions began to feel, in his mind, like a challenge to reclaim what he had lost. The same man who had been brought low rose again, not with wisdom, but with vengeance. Pride, when left unchecked, does not dissolve under consequences. It adapts, it reforms, and it disguises itself as justification. Pharaoh's pride told him that letting the Israelites go had been a mistake, that his moment of weakness had cost him control, and that the only way to restore order was through force. What he could not control through intimidation, he would now attempt to reclaim through pursuit. And so, with chariots prepared and soldiers summoned, Pharaoh mounted one final gamble, one last assertion of power against a people he no longer had any right to claim. The scene that unfolded was not merely one of military action, it was a spiritual echo of all that had come before. Pharaoh's pursuit of the Israelites into the wilderness was not a return to policy, it was a full embodiment of rebellion. He had been defeated, judged, warned, and broken, but his pride burned still. This act was not strategic. It was desperate. It was not wisdom. It was madness cloaked in armor. The same spirit that had said no to mercy in the throne room now chased deliverance into the desert. Pride, by its nature, does not concede. It would rather collapse in pursuit than kneel in surrender. As the Egyptian army approached, the Israelites found themselves trapped, the Red Sea before them, and Pharaoh's chariots behind. Fear rose in their hearts, not because they doubted God entirely, but because they had been free for only a short while and now faced annihilation. It was a moment of tension, of impossible odds, and yet the true conflict was not between the armies. It was between submission and defiance, between a people learning to trust and a man determined to dominate. Pharaoh was not simply chasing a group of former slaves. He was running toward a confrontation with God himself, a God he still refused to honor. What makes Pharaoh's pursuit so tragic is not only its futility, but its clarity. He had every opportunity to stop, every reason to reconsider, and yet the voice that once dismissed Moses in the court now thundered with rage on the battlefield. His pride had become the chariot upon which he rode, pulling him deeper into his own destruction. He had seen enough to believe, yet he chose not to. He had heard enough to tremble, yet he chose to rage. The man who once ruled the greatest empire of his time was now reduced to a fugitive of grace, hunting after those who had found what he never desired, freedom through surrender. The Israelites, though surrounded by fear, did not face Pharaoh alone. The same God who had judged Egypt now stood as a pillar of cloud and fire, separating the pursuer from the pursued. What Pharaoh failed to grasp in all his power was that the people he chased no longer belonged to him. He was not reclaiming subjects. He was trespassing upon holy ground. The deliverance of Israel was not just a historical transition. It was a spiritual transfer, a redefinition of ownership, and Pharaoh's attempt to reverse that by force was not only doomed, it was offensive to the one who had declared, "These are my people." There is a kind of defiance that reaches the point of no return, where the heart, so set on control, becomes blind to consequence. Pharaoh did not care that the odds were against him. He did not care that his own land lay in ruins. He did not care that his people wept. All that remained was the will to resist, the need to prove that no power, not even the God of Israel, could strip him of authority without a fight. This was not courage. It was the final stage of rebellion, a pride so fierce it would rather perish in pursuit than live in surrender. His story, at this point, no longer moved toward redemption. It had become a caution, a warning written not only in the annals of Egypt, but in the hearts of all who see humility as weakness. Pharaoh's final act was not one of strength. It was a descent. His horses thundered not toward victory, but into judgment. The dust of his army rose not as a sign of might, but as the prelude to collapse. And the man who could have been remembered for wisdom, who could have bowed and been spared, instead became the symbol of a heart that would not bend, even when all else had already broken. As morning light broke across the horizon and shadows fled before the rising sun, the sea that had stood as a wall of deliverance now stood poised as an instrument of judgment. Behind the Israelites, the roar of hooves and chariots echoed louder, not just in sound but in threat, carrying the weight of Pharaoh's unrelenting pride. Before them, the path of the impossible lay open, carved through waters that had no natural reason to divide. Between these two forces, despair pressing from behind and a miracle beckoning ahead, stood the people of God, not as warriors ready for battle, but as witnesses to a divine act unfolding beyond the capacity of human strength or understanding. The parting of the Red Sea was not a performance for spectacle. It was a revelation of divine will moving against the logic of nature and the dominion of empires. The waters stood as walls not only of protection, but of separation, forming a sanctuary in the midst of chaos, a corridor of escape crafted by the same voice that once spoke creation into existence. This moment was not merely about geography or terrain, it was about authority. The same God who commands the universe had chosen to intervene, not with subtle nudges, but with unmistakable force. The sea was opened not simply to provide escape, but to declare that no force on earth, no ruler enthroned, no army arrayed in power could stand against his decree. As the Israelites walked through, their steps were not just steps of movement, they were steps of transition. Every footprint pressed into the seabed marked a departure from slavery and an entrance into identity. Behind them lay generations of pain, years of chains, and the memory of a whip that never ceased. Ahead of them waited a future not yet fully known, but promised. In that space between oppression and freedom, they moved not because they had earned it, but because they had been chosen, rescued, preserved by a hand greater than their own. Pharaoh's army, driven not by justice but by vengeance, followed with a fury born not of courage but of delusion. The very path that had been made for Israel was mistaken by Egypt as an opportunity. But what was opened by faith could not be claimed by pride. The sea that had stood to defend was not theirs to pass through. They moved forward, not realizing that their pursuit was leading them into the closing grip of divine finality. The God who had waited, warned, pleaded through signs and wonders, had now drawn the line that would not be crossed. When the last of Israel's children set foot on the far shore, the moment of mercy ended and the moment of reckoning began. The waters, held back by a command only heaven could issue, returned with unrelenting force. Chariots splintered, horses vanished, warriors who had once marched with unstoppable confidence were swallowed without resistance. The sea, now no longer a parted refuge, became a grave, not of victims, but of aggressors who had defied the very voice that had carved the way before them. This was not an act of cruelty, nor the indulgence of wrath for its own sake. It was the closing of a story, the sealing of an era where oppression had once reigned unchecked. The waters did not simply collapse, they silenced. They brought an end to Pharaoh's final gamble, to Egypt's last attempt to reclaim what had already been surrendered to God. There was no one left to fight, no one left to chase, no one left to oppose the purpose of the Almighty in that moment. The sea closed not only over soldiers, but over centuries of injustice, erasing the footsteps of tyranny with a finality that no man could reverse. For the Israelites standing on the far side, what they saw behind them was not just an ocean filled with debris. It was the visual confirmation that their past could no longer pursue them. The very force that had once seemed to promise death had become the boundary of their safety. What had been fear only hours earlier had become peace. The sea had served both as path and partition, as grace for the faithful and judgment for the proud. In that one act, God had shown not only that he could deliver, but that he could conclude. The story of Pharaoh, long marked by resistance and defiance, found its end not with fanfare, but with silence. No words from the king, no final declaration, just the stillness of the waters and the memory of what had been. The sea became the tomb not only of men, but of the idea that any power could rival God's authority. The God who had opened the way had also closed the door behind his people, and in doing so had marked his faithfulness in a form none could deny. But this was more than a story of escape. It was a declaration etched into time. The God who opens the sea for those who trust him will also shut it against those who rise to destroy. He is not passive in the face of evil. He is not slow to act forever. And when he brings an end to a season of suffering, it is not partial, it is complete. Though the waves of the Red Sea settled and the sound of Egypt's pursuit faded into history, the story of deliverance did not end at that shoreline. What happened in Egypt, what unfolded in the wilderness, and what concluded with the sea's closure was not meant to be preserved merely as memory. It was meant to live as testimony. The God who shattered the pride of Pharaoh and carried an entire nation from bondage into freedom did not retire with that generation. He remains the same, active, present, and deeply involved in the lives of those who call upon him. The power to deliver was never limited to Egypt's borders or to Israel's story alone. It was never just about one nation's escape from slavery, but about a universal pattern of divine intervention that continues to echo across time. Every heart that feels trapped, every soul weighed down by shame, fear, addiction, or regret, is not beyond his reach. The same God who spoke through Moses, who parted seas and silenced tyrants, still speaks today, not through burning bushes or desert winds, but through quiet conviction, through moments of grace, through the undeniable pull toward freedom. The chains of modern bondage are rarely made of iron. They are forged in silence, hidden in the unseen corners of the heart. Many live as captives to anxiety, to ambition, to wounds left unhealed. Yet even there, God does not remain distant. He still sends his word. He still raises up deliverers. He still opens impossible paths where no path can be found. He is not a relic of the past. He is the Redeemer of the present. Pharaoh's rebellion stands as a warning, but Israel's deliverance stands as an invitation. It reminds every listener that freedom is not reserved for the perfect, but granted to those who believe. It is not earned, it is given, and it comes not through force, but through faith. The Passover lamb that once shielded a people from death pointed forward to another lamb, one whose blood would not be placed on doorposts, but poured out for the world. In him the final word on freedom was spoken, not with plagues, but with sacrifice, not with death to enemies, but with life to all who believe. The sea that once closed over Pharaoh's army now stands as a symbol of the dividing line between the past that holds us and the future that waits. We do not walk through it alone. We walk with the same presence that led Israel by cloud and fire, with the same voice that said, "Let my people go," now calling each of us to rise, to trust, and to leave behind whatever enslaves the soul. There is no bondage too deep, no guilt too heavy, no sin too dark that he cannot redeem. What God did in Egypt was not only to judge a nation, but to reveal his heart. He is not indifferent to suffering. He is not unmoved by cries for help. He does not forget promises. And when the moment is right, when hearts are ready, when the path has been prepared, he moves. Sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly, but always with purpose, always with love. This story, ancient and sacred, calls out across generations. It speaks to rulers who would exalt themselves and to the weary who feel forgotten. It calls both the oppressor and the oppressed to a higher standard, to justice, to humility, to surrender. And most of all, it invites every soul to trust in the one who still sets people free. No matter where you are in your story, whether you find yourself standing at the edge of your own Red Sea or wandering in a wilderness of uncertainty, the invitation remains. Trust the God who parts seas. Follow the voice that leads you forward. Let go of the chains you were never meant to carry. Because the God who once delivered a nation with signs and wonders is the same God who whispers now to every listening heart, "Come and be free." If this message has spoken to your heart, we invite you to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a word of encouragement and truth. Like this video to help others discover the message. Leave a comment to share your thoughts or prayers. And share this video with your family and friends. You never know who might be waiting for a word of freedom today. Thank you for watching. Stay blessed.